like to welcome everyone here today to the Honors Lecture Series on the Power of Place. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. I'd like to recognize our own Dean, Dr. John Weil, who's here with us today.
And Dean Bud Fisher. Entering
And Dean Bud Fisher from the Basic and Applied Sciences. So we welcome our deans here today. And on behalf of the University Honors College, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our distinguished visiting professor, Scott Peeples, who is professor and chair of the English department at the College of Charleston. Professor Peeples has published 2 books on Poe, the latter of which, The Afterlife of Edgar Allan Poe, received the distinguished Patrick F. Quinn Award from the Poe Studies Association in 2004. He has also written numerous articles on Poe and other topics in 19th century American literature. Professor Peeples is past editor of the journal Poe Studies and a past president of the Poe Studies Association. His current book project, tentatively titled Poe Places, is a collaboration with photographer Michelle Van Parijs. The title of his lecture today is Poe Places. And those of you visiting from my graduate seminar on Edgar Allan Poe will recognize Poe Returning to Boston by Steph Rocknack. So at this time, please join me in welcoming Professor Peeples to the University Honors College.
Well, thank you, Dr. Phillips, and thank you everyone for coming today. It's great to be here. It's an honor, and I really appreciate the hospitality of Dr. Phillips and Susan Lyons and everyone else I've met. Dr. Phillips stole my first line, actually, because I was going to ask how many people would recognize this statue or knew where it was, because it's a new statue. It was just unveiled within the last month. In Boston. And I use that I'm using this image to open things with for a couple of reasons. First, because Poe is not usually associated with Boston, more so now thanks to the efforts of Paul Lewis, who did a lot of work to get this statue completed. But we tend, if there's any city that people associate with Poe, what would you say it is, most likely? Baltimore, right? And that's because Baltimore got there first, in a way, even though it's where Poe died, not where he was born. Baltimore erected this monument in Westminster Churchyard in 1875, which was the first of many monuments built to Poe in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So Baltimore sort of claimed him, despite the fact that Poe lived only about 3 years in Baltimore, and certainly wrote larger numbers of more significant works in Philadelphia and New York. But I'm not here to sort of talk about which city has the best claim on Poe, but rather to talk about Poe and place generally, and to focus on a couple of particular places where he lived. But if you compare Poe to other 19th century American writers, he is probably less easily associated with a particular city or even a particular region. Think about, for instance, Thoreau, and you think of Concord, Massachusetts. You think of Hawthorne, and you think of Salem or Concord. Dickinson, Amherst, Whitman, New York, Irving, New York, Cooper, New York. And then even well into the 20th century, I mean, I'm thinking, of really well-known authors here, but most American authors do kind of have a place that people tend to associate with them. Southern writers especially, Faulkner, Welty, O'Connor, Tennessee Williams, all kind of have that close association. So sort of the first thing I would claim is that Poe is, if not completely unique, he's probably the most prominent exception to this rule as an American writer who is not really bound to a particular place. The problem of Poe and place is compounded by the fact that most of Poe's best-known works take place in an indeterminate location. There's no city, state, nation, region, mountain range, or other recognizable geographic location mentioned in The Raven, or The Fall of the House of Usher, or The Telltale Heart, The Mask of the Red Death, or Hop Frog. Many of his other well-known stories take place in European locations that Poe never visited. The Cask of Amontillado and the Assignation in Italy, The Pit and the Pendulum in Spain, the Murders in the Rue Morgue and the Purloined Letter in France. Of course, many of Poe's tales are set in the United States, especially after about 1843. He began to set more tales in the U.S. Most obviously, The Gold Bug, which is set on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, near where I live. And The Tale of the Ragged Mountains, set near Charlottesville, Virginia. But also Some Words with a Mummy, Morning on the Wissahickon, The Spectacles. Now, if you're taking a class on Poe, you may have recently read some of those titles. But if you're not, you probably are familiar with The Gold Bug, but maybe not those other tales. I mean, so my point again is that while Poe did set quite a few stories in the U.S., they tend not to be the stories that are most frequently studied or adapted or even really read outside of scholarly circles. And I'll stop here for a minute too, because as Dr. Phillips mentioned, I'm working on a project with a photographer, Michelle Van Paris, who's taking picture of places associated with Poe or places where Poe lived. And our hope is to continue this work with some kind of exhibit, possibly a book at some point. And this is a series of photographs she took of Sullivan's Island. This is the approximate setting of the story, The Gold Bug, as it looks today. So interwoven with the slides that I have will be some other photographs that she took, and you'll know which ones they are. I put MVP, her initials, in parentheses on those slides. The less impressive photos are probably taken by me. Back to the idea of Poe and place generally. His poetry is even less place-specific than his fiction. And since he was better known as a poet well into the 20th century than as a fiction writer, the abstraction of place became really part of his mystique. So much 20th century scholarship on Poe reinforces that idea and overplays, I think, Poe's detachment from the world around him, the real physical world. Alluding to Poe's poem Dreamland, for instance, Louis D. Rubin claimed that Poe, quote, inhabited a realm that was out of place, out of time. That out of place, out of time phrase coming from Dreamland, and it's used over and over to kind of describe Poe's use of imaginative place as opposed to real place. I'm also thinking of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a PBS series called Voices and Visions from the late 80s that was a staple of literature high school classrooms for a long time. And the one on Whitman, Allen Ginsberg is interviewed, and he's comparing Whitman and Poe and says, Poe was blind. This point is really about Whitman, that Whitman was a poet who really documented the world around him and cataloged it, right? And that Poe was not. So that too, I mean, just it became sort of a commonplace of Poe criticism up until really the last couple of decades of the 20th century. More recent scholarship has emphasized place in some ways, with an eye to how Poe's publications were interwoven into the larger political tapestry of antebellum America. And in fact, the Poe who emerges from these studies does certainly tend to be more American. Sort of the breakthrough book, I think, was The American Face of Edgar Allan Poe, which came out in around 1989, I think, 1990. But he's very much a national figure, and that's right, he certainly was, but it doesn't really speak to the problem of Poe and place. It doesn't put him in any particular region or any particular city. So, for students and fans of Poe's work, he remains enigmatic when it comes to place, vaguely connected to a half a dozen American cities, but essentially a nowhere man. So I'm interested in trying to tell Poe's story again in a way that privileges place. Not that other considerations are unimportant. I just want to see what happens when we turn up the volume on one kind of relationship in Poe's life, that is his relationships to cities primarily, as well as to neighborhoods and homes. Biographers and critics have often asked questions such as, what does it mean for Poe to lose his mother at the age of 2, almost 3, and to lose other women in his life? We've often asked about the effect of Poe's poverty and the effect that had on his criticism and fiction, the significance of his alcoholism. I would like to add a question that's related, I think, to all of those, but still distinct, and that question is, what's the significance of location and relocation, particularly in Poe's life and in his career. So Poe is always someplace, but he's never really in place. Poe's always just leaving. And so to go back, if you can mentally go back to the first slide of the new statue in Boston, it's Poe coming back, Poe returning to Boston. But I wanted to use it also, especially since it has the tour bus in the back, as sort of an emblem of Poe in motion. Poe, taking off, which is really kind of what this project is about. So I thought it might be helpful. I'm not going to, go through all this in detail, but just as a quick thumbnail of Poe's movements throughout his life, I wanted to show a few slides that emphasize how frequently he was on the move. Geographically, pretty stable throughout his childhood, mostly living in Richmond with a five-year interval in England and Scotland with the Allens. But even there, he was in boarding school most of the time, and so he was sort of not really at home, even when he was ostensibly with the Allen family a lot of the time. And then when they got back to Virginia, they moved 3 or 4 times before settling into the house that's associated with the Allen family called Moldavia. And then, of course, Charlottesville, back to Richmond, to Boston, to Sullivan's Island, to Old Point Comfort, Virginia. This is when he's in the Army. Then after the Army, back to Richmond, then to Baltimore, then back to Richmond. And so you get the idea. So even cities where Poe stays for reasonably long periods of time, for periods of years, if you look more closely, he moves within the city frequently. It's certainly the case in Philadelphia, where Poe had his greatest success as a writer, and certainly the case in New York after 1844, period of less than 2 years. He's moving about every 4 months until somewhat settling in the Bronx near Fordham. So, with the rest of the talk, I want to go back to a couple of the moments when Poe is either leaving or arriving. And I want to focus first on Richmond, and actually mostly on Richmond, to talk about what some of these removals were like and what motivated him. So, Poe leaving Richmond in 1827. This was essentially the result of a heated dispute with his foster father, John Allen, over the accumulation of debts at the University of Virginia the previous year. And in an often quoted letter to Allen from May 19th of that year, Poe tries to adopt a mature, rational tone. And he's not really being that mature or rational, but he wants to appear that way. After announcing his intention, which is, quote, to find some place in this wide world where I will be treated not as you have treated me, he assures Allen, this is not a hurried decision, but one which I have long considered. And having so considered, my resolution is unalterable. You may perhaps think that I have flown off in a passion and that I am already wishing to return, but not so. I will give you the reasons which have actuated me, and then judge. So it's not hard to guess why Poe would think that Allen would think that he had flown off in a passion, or that he already wants to return. But no, says Poe, echoing the Declaration of Independence, whose lead author, of course, had just founded the school that Poe had just left. He declares the causes which impel him to separation. First reason, you wouldn't pay for my university education. He says, I had been led to expect that it would at some future time be granted, but in a moment of caprice, you have blasted my hope, because forsooth I disagreed with you in an opinion, which opinion I was forced to express. Second reason, you don't love me. He writes, I have heard you say, when you little thought I was listening and therefore must have said it in earnest, that you had no affection for me. The third reason, and I'll just paraphrase this one, you told me to leave and quit sponging off of you, but you refused to set me up with a job, which you could easily do. And finally, he claims that Allen has humiliated him because he's an orphan. He says, quote, you suffer me to be subjected to the whims and caprice not only of your white family, but the complete authority of the blacks. These grievances I could not submit to, and I am gone. Poe struggles to maintain that legalistic language of a resolution against his anger and sadness. The tension as he asks the man he has just upbraided the tension continues as he asks the man he has just upbraided to send him his trunk and enough money for him to relocate for a month. Allen must have told Poe that he wasn't capable of surviving on his own, or something like that, for Poe adds, if you still have the least affection for me, as the last call I shall make on your bounty, to prevent the fulfillment of the prediction you this morning expressed, send me as much money as will defray my passage, etc. He concludes the letter, if you fail to comply with my request, I tremble for the consequence. Again, Poe is simultaneously crying for affection, clearly wanting not only money, but a continuation of his relationship with Allen, even as he insists that he is breaking ties and striking out on his own. He writes again the next day, still in Richmond, conjuring images of himself without food, wandering the streets, and promising, I sail on Saturday. The final line before his signature is, give my love to all at home. And the postscript reads, I have not 1 cent in the world to provide any food. For all the histrionics of these letters, there's little doubt that Poe was really suffering in May of 1827. This is a traumatic moment for him, the departure that truly uprooted Poe and began his life of itinerancy. That's not to say that the break with Allen was clean. They later reconciled and split again, and the trail of letters continues for another 6 years. But the events that precipitated Poe's departure from Richmond in 1827 are what he returns to in those later letters, repeatedly going back to this moment and repeatedly trying to justify his actions in Charlottesville and to regain Allen's affection, and of course, simultaneously to get him to send some money. And in those later letters, Poe repeatedly uses the word home in reference to Richmond and Moldavia, the Allen mansion, and this is obviously not a photograph from the time that Poe lived there, but from, I think, the early 20th century before it was torn down. In February 1829, writing from Fort Monroe and trying to explain to Allen what went wrong 2 years earlier, he writes, I had never been home. I'd never been from home before for any length of time. In July 1829, writing from Baltimore, upon receiving some money from Allen, he refers to the length of time I have been from home, and heartbreakingly writes asking, quote, for information as to what course I must pursue. I would have returned home immediately, but for the words in your letter, I am not particularly anxious to see you. I know not how to interpret them. Even after Francis Allen's death and until John Allen's remarriage, Poe continued to refer to Richmond as home. I'm going to take just a second here. I'll put up a slide of the same site, the same intersection, 5th and Main, in Richmond as it appears today, where the Allen Mansion, Moldavia, stood. In the Richmond Poe Museum, if you ever go there, there is a wonderful model of the city of Richmond in Poe's time. And this is a close-up shot of that same plot, that same block where the Allen Mansion stood. But it's really, it's kind of antique and kind of spectacular at the same time. It takes up a wall about the size of the stage, and it's just this extremely detailed 3D map of Virginia that was done in the 1920s for the Poe Museum. Of course, it's impossible to disentangle his relationship with Richmond from his relationship with Allen, especially when the best documentary evidence concerning the departure are letters from Allen. But I think it's such an emotional moment for Poe because Richmond really was his home. Poe's self-image was shaped here by a hierarchical culture. Allen was a merchant, not a planner, but when he inherited an estate worth about $750,000, and that's not adjusted for inflation, it was, $750,000 then, from his uncle William Galt, Allen became a wealthy Virginia gentleman. Poe was brought up to be a member of Richmond society, yet never really had any legal or socially recognized claim on John Allen. Richmond combined the social stratification of class and race with a certain degree of social mobility up and down. Growing up in the urban South, particularly in the house of a merchant, Poe had seen both the rigidity of class and the fluidity of capital. As one piece of evidence of Poe's internalization of that hierarchy, I just read a line from the letter expressing his outrage at being subject to the authority of the blacks. Now, a lot's been written about Poe's exposure to slavery in Richmond and Baltimore and how it affected his work. But consider how pervasive not just the institution, like just the existence of slavery around him was, but how much Poe was exposed to the trade in slavery being in Richmond. Poe lived with the Allens in the early 1820s on a street known as Tobacco Alley, within a block or two of a slave jail and an auction house, a couple of blocks from the docks where enslaved people were being shipped up and down the eastern seaboard. This is a monument to the suffering of enslaved people who were bought and sold in Richmond. And this is, you can, walk a block or two and be where Poe was living in the early 1820s from this site. Walk another block or two in another direction, and you're at the site of the Southern Literary Messenger, where he worked in the 1830s. So he was right, he was right in the middle of it. Is my point. So Richmond was also a city that Poe must have associated heavily with loss. He grew up there because his mother had died there. He attended church with the Allens on the site of a great tragedy that he likely associated with his mother's death. She didn't die in the Richmond theater fire of 1811, but she had performed there at the theater for the last time in October of that year. She died on December 8th, and the fire occurred on December 26th. The church was literally a monument to the 72 victims of the fire, and it must have seemed to Poe that his mother was one of them, considering how young he was when it happened, considering that he grew up hearing about this great tragedy and going to church on the site of that tragedy. And he goes there, so he's going there every Sunday with the Allens in the 1820s. This is another one of Michelle's photographs of the dome of the monumental church, which I just thought was really nice, and a photograph of the pew where the Allens worshipped, and that marker is actually to Poe's foster mother, Frances Allen. So there was no marked grave for Poe's mother, but he certainly would have visited the grave of a woman named Jane Stith Stannard. by whom he was inspired to write the poem to Helen. She was, as you may know if you've been dipping into Poe biography for a class this semester, she was the mother of a boyhood friend of Poe's. He was infatuated with her, but very much in a kind of mother-son kind of way, and really was looking for some emotional bond with her. And she died tragically young, and Poe was known to go and visit her grave on Shockoe Hill Cemetery. So when Poe returned to Richmond, he could go to that same cemetery and visit the grave of his foster mother, Frances Allen. The two graves are actually very close to each other in Shockoe Hill Cemetery. And for another kind of loss that Poe would have associated with Richmond, when he left for the University of Virginia in 1826, he and a young woman by the name of Elmira Royster had apparently become engaged, had some kind of agreement between them. But when Poe returned from Charlottesville, he discovered that she was now engaged to another man, whom she did marry, largely the result of her parents' intervention, not wanting her to marry Poe, but to marry a much more prosperous suitor. And that's exactly what happened. So Poe repeated this departure from Richmond that I've been describing a decade later. And over the course of that decade, he had published a book of poems, joined the Army, been discharged from the Army, published another book of poems, gotten an appointment to West Point, gotten court-martialed, moved to Baltimore, published another book of poems, began publishing stories, married his cousin, and then moved back to Richmond to edit the Southern Literary Messenger. That's the fastest biographical account of the decade of Poe's life that you're ever going to hear. He stayed for about 2 years, achieving success as an editor and reviewer, and writing some of his first major stories. So, why did he leave Richmond and his first steady job in early 1837? It's not entirely clear, but somehow things had come to a breaking point between Poe and the Messenger's owner and nominal editor, Thomas Willis White. Arthur Hobson Quinn, in his monumental 1941 biography, suggests that Poe wanted to leave. Quinn writes, "There were good reasons why Poe was willing to break the relation. His earlier gratitude to White for his meager salary had given place to a restless feeling that he was not being fully repaid for his skill and industry. The disturbed conditions in Richmond, his longing for a wider sphere, the pressure of financial necessity may have caused him to feel that the risk lay not in leaving but in staying as editor." Quinn's reading was indirectly challenged by a later biographer, Kenneth Silverman, who writes, "Poe lingered in Richmond through January, perhaps to get reinstated." And citing letters from White, Silverman speculates that Poe's employer was, quote, feeling increasingly pestered by Poe's presence in early 1837. Financial difficulties, which forced White to suspend publication for 2 months in late 1836, had something to do with the breakup, as did Poe's drinking and his acerbic reviews, both of which White implored him to temper. White's letters suggest a replay of the strained, ultimately broken foster father and son relationship Poe had had with John Allen in the same city, only blocks away from the Messenger's office, in fact. White wrote to his associate Beverly Tucker not long before Poe moved to New York, "Poe pesters me no little. He is trying every maneuver to foist himself on someone at the North. He is continually after me for money." This sounds kind of familiar. "I am sick of his writings as I am of him, and am rather more than half inclined to send him up another $12 in the morning, and along with it all his unpublished manuscripts." For his part, Poe referred to White in an 1840 letter as illiterate and vulgar, although well-meaning. Poe had no prospects elsewhere, and in fact his departure from Richmond in 1837 leads into what Silverman calls the blank period. There are no extant letters by Poe from February 1837 to July 1838. That's kind of a long time to have almost no evidence of what he was doing, though we do know that he was in New York. The blankness of this period might be compared to the blank spot in Poe biography created by his time in the Army 10 years earlier. And in that case, we know more specifically where he was, at least, but we know little else. These disruptions, leaving Richmond and Allen for a completely uncertain future in Boston, leaving Richmond and White for a completely uncertain future in New York, are obviously crucial parallel moments. In the novel that is Poe's life, these episodes prefigure a third departure from Richmond in 1849, a journey to New York that leads to the last and most puzzling blank spot in Poe biography, the week-long period preceding his hospitalization and death. Richmond, then, is the home Poe had to leave repeatedly, characterized by broken relationships with his father figures, and the loss of women he loved. In the weeks leading up to his last departure from the city, he was again courting the now widowed Elmira Royster Shelton in her beautiful house across the street from the church that she attended and the churchyard where Poe's mother was buried in an unmarked grave at that point, and Thomas Willis White was also buried. And this is St. John's Church on Shockoe Hill in Richmond. And this is the house where Poe would have been visiting Elmira Shelton, right across the street from that churchyard where he knew that his mother lay buried. Elmira Royster Shelton's marker near her grave, with my photographer collaborator's shadow kind of taken to suggest, well, whatever you wanted to suggest, I guess. Okay, so since the title of the talk is Poe Places, I didn't want to just do Richmond, so I'll spend a few minutes on another significant Poe place that maybe doesn't get as much attention as Baltimore, and that's New York. We don't know much about Poe in New York in 1837-38, but there's a lot of information about his much longer residence there from 1844 until his death in 1849. A renter, like most New Yorkers of his time, Poe, along with Virginia and Maria Clem, had at least 5 different residences between April 44, when they moved from Philadelphia, and May of 46. From a boarding house at 136 Greenwich Street, he moved the family to the Brennan Farm, which is now the Upper West Side. They moved back to the city proper in 1845 because what's now the Upper West Side was not really part of the city when Poe lived there. And then again to Greenwich Street, a different house, then a year later to East Broadway, then to Amity Street, which is now West 3rd Street, Greenwich Village, where New York University is, and where Poe House was essentially destroyed to make room for a new building several years ago. And then to another sort of rustic habitation called Turtle Bay, and what's now East 47th Street. And then finally out to Fordham in May of 1846. Now, considering Poe's low income, this is the Fordham Cottage you've probably seen other pictures of, and kind of conveniently for my talk, it had to be moved from the site where Poe and his family lived to what's now Poe Park in the Bronx, but the cottage itself is intact. So considering Poe's low income, probably about $700 for 1845, the year he published The Raven, and the frequency of his moves, on average a move every 4 months in a 2-year period, it seems likely that at least some of these changes of address were the result either of eviction or threat of eviction. Upon his arrival in New York, Poe began publishing correspondence with the Columbia, Pennsylvania newspaper, The Spy, and this series of letters was called Doings of Gotham. Having just moved from Philadelphia, Poe makes occasional reference to his former home, but he neither declares nor implies any moral judgment on New York through these comparisons, other than to point out that Gotham is generally dirtier than its rival. Poe remarks significantly on the rapid pace, and particularly the pace of change in New York. I'm going to read a little bit of a passage from Doings of Gotham. A day or two ago, I procured a light skiff, and with the aid of a pair of sculls, as they here term short oars or paddles, made my way around Blackwell's Island. on a voyage of discovery and exploration. The chief interest of the adventure lay in the scenery of the Manhattan shore, which is here particularly picturesque. The houses are, without exception, frame and antique. Nothing very modern has been attempted, a necessary result of the subdivision of the whole island into streets and town lots. I could not look on the magnificent cliffs and stately trees at which every moment met my view without a sigh for their inevitable doom, inevitable and swift. In 20 years or 30 at farthest, we shall see here nothing more romantic than shipping warehouses and wharves. So here we have Poe not slouched over a writing desk, not wearing that worried look as he takes the drink that will lead to 3 days' debilitation, and not hovering over Virginia's sickbed, but paddling a little boat, looking up and enjoying the scenery, even lamenting the inevitable loss of natural beauty. Whether or not Poe really took time out to paddle on the East River and contemplate the transformation of his environment, he was comfortable adopting the persona of someone who did. Poe seems to have known that this sort of excursion, these sorts of observations on the changing cityscape, the destruction of anything old, even the semi-detachment of a journalist who can appreciate what is being lost as the city changes and grows, were the sorts of things that people wanted to read. This is what people expected to hear about New York. Because this is, today, as it is today, back then as well. New York was associated with the future. It was associated with constant change, constant bustle, and Poe is plugging into that. Let me read you another, this is from his very first letter from New York, another description that I think emphasizes this even more. We are not yet over the bustle of the 1st of May. Keep moving have been the watchwords for the last fortnight. The man who in New York would be so bold as not to peregrinate on the 1st would beyond doubt attain immortality as the great unmoved, a title applied by Horn, the author of Orion, to one of his heroes, Akhenatos, the type and spirit of apathy. Just to give you an idea, this was fairly commonplace, this kind of writing about New York. Lydia Maria Child, who had written around the same time a collection called Letters from New York, has a very similar description of New York on moving day. I'll read just a little bit of that, just so you hear how close Poe's language sounds to hers. She says, all New York moves on the 1st of May, not only moves about as usual in the everlasting hurry-scurry of business, but one house empties itself into another all over the city. The streets are full of loaded drays on which tables are dancing and carpets rolling to and fro. Do you want an appropriate emblem of the country of this age? Then stand on the sidewalks of New York and watch the universal transit on the 1st of May. Child notes that this phenomenon, once a function of leases and fluctuating housing market, has taken on a life of its own as a ritual. Like Poe remarking on the oddity of the great unmoved, she quotes a neighbor who said he would be ashamed not to move on May 1st. Poe is obviously not in the habit of waiting until May Day to move, but his and Child's comments indicate that his experiment of going from boarding house to farm to boarding house to boarding house to cottage was not unusual, that he was participating in the universal transit, as Child calls it, that characterized New York. Okay, so Richmond and New York present two contrasting notions of home for Poe, and this is sort of where I want to conclude with this idea of home. The first, Richmond, a seemingly more stable place, but one where he really had no solid footing, and a place freighted with grief over a sequence of losses. New York had not even the appearance of stability or stasis, and yet, had Poe been financially more successful, and had his wife not been terminally ill from the time they arrived there, he might have been quite comfortable in the tumultuous media mecca. But for the sake of economy and Virginia's health, he repeatedly sought dwellings outside the city, removed from the hustle, filth, and smoke of the publishing district and lower Manhattan generally. After a lifelong search, he might have found a home in the Fordham Cottage, which of course is now a museum, in the Bronx. But even in the relative comfort of the cottage, the family lived on the edge of poverty. And Virginia died less than a year after the move. And interior of the Poe Cottage. Of course, Poe became deeply grief-stricken after Virginia's death, and then became desperate to find a new wife, and so he spent a lot of time on the road in other cities, away from the house he now shared only with his mother-in-law. What I'm suggesting is simply that Poe spent his entire adult life in search of a home. My larger claim, which I'll outline quickly by way of conclusion, is that his sense of dislocation and the need to somehow get back home has a particular resonance in Poe's era. There's a wealth of scholarship on the ideology surrounding the home, particularly as a loss or absence in 19th century America. For example, in her essay Reclaiming Sentimental Literature, which draws primarily from 19th century American sources, Joanne Dobson posits that, quote, "The principal theme of the sentimental text is the desire for bonding, and it is affiliation on the plane of emotion, sympathy, nurturance, or similar moral or spiritual inclination for which sentimental writers and readers yearn. Violation, actual or threatened, of the affectional bond generates the primary tension in the sentimental text and leads to bleak, dispirited, anguished, sometimes outraged representations of human loss." That's all from Dobson. Now, other scholars have identified the sentimentalism in Poe's work, particularly his poetry, but in this talk I've tried to emphasize how Poe biography can be read against Dobson's description of what was one of the most pervasive literary and cultural dispositions of the 19th century. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. Part of the chorus of Home Sweet Home, one of the most popular songs of 19th century America, which debuted in 1823. It was a runaway sheet music bestseller throughout the century. It was sung regularly by Jenny Lind, the most popular female singer of the century, on her American tour. And maybe somebody here, this being Murfreesboro, can attest to the validity of the legend that Home Sweet Home was the song that was played by both Union and Confederate bands on the eve of the Battle of Stones River. At any rate, I read it somewhere, so I assume it's true. We might also think of Stephen Foster's Old Folks at Home, My Old Kentucky Home, though those both postdate Poe's death by just a few years. The tradition that these songs participate in, and which continued throughout the history of popular and especially country music, all but requires that the song be voiced by someone who is separated from home. In a recent article analyzing the history of the song Home Sweet Home, Bridget Bennett quotes its author, John Howard Payne, saying, "My yearnings toward home became stronger as the term of my exile lengthens. I feel the want of you, parts of myself, in this strange world, for though I am naturalized to vagabondage, still it is but vagabondage. I long for a home about me." Though one might say Poe maintained a home with Virginia and Maria Clem, home being wherever they were together, there remains a difference, I think, between having a family and having a home. And that difference can be seen in the story of someone who moves his small family a dozen times in 6 years. Like Payne, Poe became naturalized to vagabondage. But my claim is that vagabondage and a longing for home, a place to call his own, make Poe not alien to antebellum America, but absolutely in tune with it. Thank you.
We do have time for questions.
You didn't deal with his demise, but I know several years ago there was a theory that maybe he died from rabies instead of from alcohol. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's true. I think because the rabies theory, it sounded cool and different. It got a lot of press. But my sense was that it was based on unreliable accounts of Poe's symptoms at the time of his death. and I never took it all that seriously. Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed the whole talk, thank you. I was particularly interested in your comments about the music of that time period. Do we know, does anyone know, have you come across any kind of references in his writings or perhaps in his library about the music? I mean, I know it's in general play, but any comments by him?
Wow, that's really good. Well, Poe refers to music a lot in a kind of abstract way, since his theory of poetry is closely tied to music. But offhand, I can't think of discussions of particularly popular music that he would have been listening to.
Were there piano pieces in the house?
I don't think. Well, there probably would have been, and in at least one, in some of the places where they lived, there would have been a piano. I mean, tragically, Virginia was singing when she had her first hemorrhage with the onset of tuberculosis in 1842. So there was certainly music in the household. I'm not really sure anyone has uncovered sort of exactly what, sort of what they listened to and what they performed. Of course, his mother also was not just an actress, but a singer. And what was it? Do you remember the song that she was famous for?
I know that she sang The Market Last.
The Market Last. Nobody Come to Marry Me, I think, was another song that was closely associated with Eliza Poe. So that's not really an answer to your question, but it's all I can think of in relation to Poe and music right now.
So you focused on Richmond today and also New York. Your larger body of work, will it look at other places associated, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia?
Yeah, that's the plan. If this becomes a book, which I hope it will, each chapter would start with a removal, would start with Poe leaving somewhere, and then go back to talk about what that place had meant to him, leading up to his departure. So this is sort of, this presentation mostly is kind of a draft of what I would do with a chapter on Poe leaving Richmond, and then trying to maybe go a little further than I did today into what Richmond meant to him and what his experiences were like there. So yeah, another one for the transition from Philadelphia to New York, from Richmond to New York to Philadelphia in the mid-1830s, and so on, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about the places he had never visited? What are his sources? What were his sources for this? Do we know his sources for the places he had never visited?
Books. What he knew about Paris was what anybody who hadn't been to Paris knew about Paris from reading about it.
You started the lecture by talking about the fact that his stories a lot of them don't have a particular place, and those that do have very varied locations. Do you see a direct connection with that and the fact that he himself didn't have a home? Do you think that's why none of his stories, because he never felt connected to a specific place? Is that why his stories are all over the place?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That it certainly makes sense that if you don't grow up with a strong identification with the place you were born and where you intend to take root and spend the rest of your life, it's a lot less likely that you'll want to write fiction that tries to tell people what it's like to really feel that and to live there. So it's maybe a little curious that Richmond didn't supply that for Poe, but I think the circumstances under which he was raised there probably kept him from being attached in that way, even though I think it's the closest thing he ever had to a home. But yeah, I mean, your question, I think, is actually a good insight. I think that's probably the answer. Yeah.
Some of Poe's darker tales represent the darker transitions he has from place to place throughout his life.
I would put it a little bit differently. I think maybe, and I haven't really worked through this, but I think maybe because Poe doesn't have that kind of stability, and particularly a stable home life, there are a lot of his darkest stories involve, if not, well, let's say domestic violence for one thing, if you think about The Black Cat, or The Fall of the House of Usher, which in which the house, of course, stands for the family, and at the end it implodes. Trying to think of another. It'd be great if I could come up with another example right now. The Telltale Heart. He's got a kind of family. The narrator has a kind of family with the old man, which he, completely subverts by killing him and then, literally burying him underneath the floorboards. The fact that, even the fact that the hearth is the place where the narrator of The Black Cat entombs his dead wife. And there's this kind of subversion of what a happy home is supposed to be. And I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious, but I think with your question, what Poe tends to do is to create these nightmare versions of Home Sweet Home. And that you might very well attribute to the fact that he, didn't feel that he really had one, even though I think, he was extremely attached to Virginia and Muddy. That still wasn't quite the idyllic home that he had in mind. Yeah.
Did Poe ever have a place where he was happy? Like, it seems kind of sad.
Well, I don't think so. It's really, I think he came closest maybe in Philadelphia before Virginia got sick. This would be maybe around 1840, 41. Things were going about as well for him career-wise as they were ever going to go. And he actually did live in the same house for about a year. So that, it might have been then. I mean, it was probably, the point where things were going reasonably well and were reasonably stable. But for the most part, no. I mean, I think poverty, frustration, a kind of self-destructive personality, and bad luck just sort of conspired to keep Poe from ever having a protracted period of satisfaction or happiness.
Any other questions? Right, please join me in thanking your speaker.
Thanks.